Today on the podcast, we welcome Sam Dalrymple, a historian and writer whose life's work involves stories around Southeast Asia's borders. Today, we talk about partition and the memories from there that have connected people across nations and borders. Why does the book start in the 1920s? What was kind of pivotal in that moment?
Sure. The 1920s is a world that's deeply unfamiliar to us, I think. It kind of starts around the moment that Congress makes its famous declaration of Purna Swaraj, the demand for complete independence from Britain. But at that moment, India looks completely different from the India that we're familiar with. It's 2.5 times bigger than the Republic of India today. And it's not just the kind of undivided India that we're used to, the India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but the Raj, or the Indian Empire, as it's known in British officialdom, is this kind of colonial entity that stretches all the way from modern Yemen. The city of Aden is India's westernmost city, governed from Bombay, all the way as far east as Rangoon in what's now Myanmar. And this colony of India encompasses 1/4 of the world's population, the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Zoroastrian populations on the planet. And in a sense, over the next 5 decades, 5 partitions will tear this world apart and turn it into 12 nation states. You've got Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. But what's insane is in the 1920s, when that declaration of Purna Swaraj happens, not a single one of these partitions is necessarily inevitable yet.
But the combined entity, the British Raj or India, right? In your mind, is that entity itself made by the British? So that is to say that for all of us growing up, or even when we talk about Akhand Bharat, or when we talk about any of these things, they kind of never assume most of these entities. And I don't think anybody longs for them in the traditional sense. So how did British Raj end up sort of subsuming everything?
So the Raj is basically the nationalized versions of everywhere that the East India Company conquered. So the East India Company is a company. It spends the kind of 18th and 19th century conquering random territories, often territories linked by trade and trade routes. And then after 1857, the Raj is nationalized and becomes India, basically. And, Sri Lanka was made into a separate colony already, but essentially everywhere under the East India Company's control in 1858 becomes India.
And so, just one second. So India is effectively a creation of the East India Company.
Of the East India Company. And there's a legal statute that's passed that's called the Interpretation Act that basically defines everywhere under the purview of the Viceroy as legally India and the people living within these territories as Indians. So that remarkably in the 1920s, the term Indian legally extends to anyone living in Dubai. But crucially, so how much did anyone feel Indian in these places? It changes from place to place. So you do actually have some of the biggest politicians in Burma are like this guy Mahatma Uttama, who spends the entirety of the second half of his career campaigning for Burma to be recognized as an integral part of India. And you have Arabs in Yemen arguing the same thing for Yemenis. So there's a whole weird group of things.
But they were Indian just sort of in this ephemeral way, or did they have physical things that tied them to India? So, when you say they were ruled from Bombay, practically what does that mean for an individual in Yemen or Myanmar?
So it means that they are protected by the Indian army. They're using the Indian rupee. They have Indian passports. They use the Indian legal system. So they have all the kind of bits that one has as part of a state. Okay. What's important to realize is that particularly in the early 20th century, ideas of nationhood was still, people had already, huge numbers of people had decided that they wanted the British out. But there was still massive disagreement on what came next. So you have people like Gandhi arguing that we need the geographical contours of our future nation to match that of Bharatvarsh, this ancient idea rooted in the Mahabharata, one of the most ancient epics ever created by humanity. And yet, there are so many other visions that we've forgotten because it's ultimately that one that wins out. There's a whole series of visions that would have had the future Indian nation inherit this entire kind of, geopolitical unit in some sense. So you have, a journalist in Yemen called Muhammad Ali Luqman creating a vision where the entire Gulf was an integral part of a future Indian nation.
What was in your mind, kind of the last nail in the coffin for the big partition?
The big partition?
Well, where it could have been avoided.
So, in order to answer this question, I think it's important to make a crucial distinction. So, Jinnah, the founder, the leader of the Muslim League, first demands a nation called Pakistan in Lahore in 1940. It's known as the Pakistan Resolution. The crucial thing that we need to remember is that he's demanding a nation, and he's not demanding a nation state. And
what's the difference?
So in Britain today, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are all part of Great Britain, but they are all also regarded as nations in and of themselves. Okay. And I think that Jinnah may have been demanding something similar to that initially. The fact that in 1946, he accepts the cabinet mission plan. This is a plan suggested to the Muslim League and the Congress in a last-ditch attempt, essentially, to try and, by the Brits, to try and keep everything together. And the idea is that it's going to grant both India and both a united India and a Pakistan at the same time. The idea was that you would have 5 states in a federated system. You'd have West Pakistan, East Pakistan, North India, South India, and Deccan.
Wait.
And this is
the British are trying to keep this thing together?
The British, at this point, the British change what they're doing a lot. So, different viceroys are pursuing different tactics. Different agendas. And I think that, just like every government change, you have politicians who change parties. I think that, Viceroy Linlithgow, who is very pro-Muslim League and very anti-Congress, pursues a very different agenda from Wavell, who's much more even-handed, who pursues a very different agenda from Mountbatten, who gets on very well with Nehru but hates Jinnah's guts. And so I think you have to look at each of these viceroys rather differently.
So in 46, it's Mountbatten.
It's Mountbatten. In 46, it's Wavell.
Wavell. So he's more even-handed.
He's the even-handed guy.
So he comes in with a EU version of India.
Basically, yes. He's like, let's all create some sort of, or United States, where, how in the States, like each state has its own lawmaking abilities, etc., and different business codes, but, they are part of a country. And that's what's proposed. And crucially, Jinnah accepts.
So in 1946, there is a moment at which, and does the Congress seem okay with it?
A lot of the Congress is, but eventually Gandhi and Nehru basically pull out over a rather anodyne amendment.
But in that moment?
In that moment, initially, yes. They tentatively say yes, and then at the last moment, they pull out over some minor footnote related to the status of Peshawar in this federation.
So we'll get to that, but just so that I understand. So there is a moment in 1946, which is close enough to final independence, where it's serious. Like, it's not like
it's a year away.
Yeah. Where there is 5 nation states, and those 5 nation states form a part of the United Kingdom of India, so to speak. And so we play separate cricket, but we have the same army, and we defend each other, and so on and so forth.
Precisely. So just like, England and Scotland will have separate football teams.
Yeah, exactly. Football teams.
And yet they share share a military.
All the passports.
All the passports, etc. That was the suggestion given to the Muslim League and Congress.
Very widely known at all.
No. And well, I think it is amongst scholars. And I think that every scholar I know who has worked on this period, their heart breaks when reading about the cabinet mission plan, because so much of the violence that follows, I think, could have been avoided.
And that may follow.
Yes.
What is the Peshawar footnote?
The Peshawar footnote was should the region around Peshawar, because Northwest Frontier was voted in by a Congress, was voted in Peshawar. And so the Congress were saying the northwest frontier should form part of the North India part of the Federation rather than the West Pakistan part of the Federation. And this is the stumbling block. This is one of the 3 or 4 stumbling blocks that some of them are very nitty-gritty that I think would be far too complicated to get into here. But the Peshawar one shows you the kind of like rather minor amendments that this plan breaks down over. And it's so close to coming to fruition that it hurts.
So Jinnah obviously is an extremely complicated character. And sort of in those moments, in that 46, 47 moment in the call to action day, he obviously gets a lot of the blame. And that's how our history is taught as well. And we were chatting before, that wasn't the old Jinnah. Jinnah was kind of almost moderate for the longest time. So, who is Jinnah and sort of how does he reach this stage in 46 where he says, you know what, just let's break this up?
I think of all the figures in my book, Jinnah is by far the most fascinating because the more that you read his letters and his communications, the more that you realize this is a man that doesn't fit either the Indian or the Pakistani stereotypes of him. Mm-hmm. And I think because we want to kind of, say in school, Gandhi said this and Jinnah said this and Nehru said this and Savarkar said this and, Sardar Patel said this and etc., that we overlook how much Jinnah changes in the course of his life. In the 1920s, he is basically regarded as the most important Indian nationalist. And Sarojini Naidu, the most important kind of female Indian nationalist, and the woman whose letters that I enjoyed reading more than any other figure in this whole thing. I think Sarojini needs a biography ASAP, and someone needs to get on this.
Or a movie. She is amazing, and literally I was not expecting to kind of crackle with laughter at her wit. Just every letter is amazing. But she regards Jinnah as the greatest ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity in the 1920s. Okay. She gives him a trophy for being the greatest ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. And Jinnah only leaves the Congress in the 1920s because he has a falling out with Gandhi. And Gandhi is talking about Bharatvarsh and, separating off Burma. And Jinnah considers Gandhi to be bringing religion into politics. And so he leaves Congress because Gandhi's bringing religion into politics. So Jinnah thinks Gandhi is to the right of him? Yes. And I think that this is, again, I think that the trajectories of the two men over the course of the next 20 years kind of go like this. They cross paths. So by 1947, Gandhi is leading Hindu-Muslim peace marches through Bengal and essentially kind of, is one of the greatest and most important reasons why Bengal did not face the same violence as Punjab. And this is widely regarded to be the case. So Gandhi in the 1940s is doing this whilst Jinnah is saying kind of, I will have a broken India. But the Jinnah of the 20s is not that man. And the Jinnah of the 20s is this kind of fashionable lawyer driving around Marine Drive in fast open-top cars with his Parsi wife. He's a rather tortured man. And so he gradually, as his career begins to decline because of Gandhi's rise, he becomes a kind of neglectful husband. And then his wife, it seems, commits suicide. And that changes him fundamentally as a person. Again, so the official narrative is never that his wife committed suicide, but a series of letters discovered by Sheila Reddy in her book, Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah, suggests that this is the case. Well, when was that event? That, I can't remember the year, I'm afraid. But do you think that event having, that kind of liberal sounding board could have changed his perspective? Yeah, I think the fact that he's kind of badly treated by Nehru specifically, that when he's dealing with his wife's addiction, actually, at one point, and has to go look after her in hospital. Nehru passes a series of amendments in Parliament that Jinnah had been working on, and Jinnah feels actively betrayed by this. And so at the same time as dealing with this personal tragedy, I think it's the 1920s that all this happens. I can't remember the exact year, but he feels a personal animosity towards the new Congress leadership, Nehru and Gandhi. And I think that this is so important in understanding
what happens later, because Jinnah will increasingly see Muslims as needing, political representation at the same time as his personal relationships with the Congress plummet. And what this, the events of 1947 are rather extraordinary because of how much they are determined by a small handful of men. And they are all men.
I was just going to say, it's just 4 people or 3 people. And so it seems like Jinnah is convinced that the leadership of the Congress would not represent the Muslims at all.
Yeah.
By 47.
Yeah. He had hope in 1920s that might be able to be the case, but he grows more and more convinced. I think particularly in the late 1930s, there's a series of pogroms that kill Muslims in UP, and the local Congress leadership doesn't do anything about it. And that is a real turning point for him, because he sees this as, a great betrayal. So that by 1940, he starts to suggest, we need an independent Muslim state. And this is such an important distinction from what he's fighting for in the 1920s, that his early views are so distinct from his later views. But I think that his life to some degree is a bit like a Shakespearean tragedy. I think it's important to remember that after finally achieving the country that he dreamed of creating, his daughter Jinnah refuses to join him there. Yeah. And she never actually, sees him again after, and she stays behind in Bombay, marrying the Wadia family. Yeah. And I think it's Alan Campbell Johnson, who's the kind of PR guy for Mountbatten, who describes Pakistan's Independence Day in the celebrations in Karachi as a very strange thing, because despite all these Muslim League politicians celebrating, Jinnah is looking distant because his daughter has not come to join him.
Yeah. So the partition is going to go through. All of this happens. How did they draw the borders? How did why is East Bengal with Pakistan, or why don't we get Dravid Nadu? How do we end up with the current borders?
So here, I think Mountbatten is key. Mountbatten set out in March 1947. In June 1947, he announces that he is going to be handing over power to both an Indian government and a Pakistani government, and that he's not going to be trying for a united India anymore. And the crucial announcement happens a day after this, where he announces that despite having been given despite having been given a year and a half by Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister of Britain, Mountbatten announces he's going to try and do the whole thing in 77 days. Why? So that he can get it all complete by the 2nd anniversary of Japan's defeat in World War II on 15th August 1947. So that is why Independence Day is when it is.
We're on 15th August.
To commemorate Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
To irritate the Japanese?
Yes, essentially.
All right. Okay.
It's horrendous. And so Mountbatten rushes this, and so begins essentially one of the great...
There was no pushback?
Sorry?
There was no pushback internally from the Indians, from the Pakistanis?
There's shock and awe. And I think Shahid Hamid, who is one of the major figures in the army, I believe, at the time, later plays an important role in, I think, Pakistani intelligence. He writes of creating 2 states in 77 days, there is no precedent in history. And suddenly bureaucrats are assigned in dividing everything from rivers to stationary sets to the military.
I mean, that's some of the stuff we have read.
Yeah.
But the deadline was set because of just arbitrary World War II date.
Mountbatten announces a few weeks later why he's asked why he chose that date, and he thought it could be nice to do it by the anniversary.
So in that moment, right, when we read it, Patel is, Sardarji is obviously an extremely important part of convincing the states. What's that play like? What's the play of the Indian Home Ministry, of Jinnah, of Mountbatten in drawing the borders as we see them?
So this is what I refer to as, in some sense, the fourth partition. So we've had Burma, we've had Arabia, we've had the Great Partition of 47. 80% of the modern India-Pakistan border is not determined by Cyril Radcliffe, this lawyer who is brought in to divide British India. And he is tasked with figuring out contiguous Muslim majority areas and Hindu and Sikh majority areas and dividing them with a line.
Yeah.
He divides British India, but the princely states, these 565 states, are essentially given the option to join one state or the other by the British or remain independent. Crucially, some do remain independent. I think it's often dismissed as an idea that's ridiculous, and yet Nepal and Bhutan are registered as princely states in numerous colonial documents, and they provide a legal case for why they should be given independence that is recognized.
And they remain independent.
And they remain independent to this day. Sikkim, interestingly, is also allowed independence at the same moment, although later joins India in 75. So Sardar Patel plays a crucial role in basically bringing states round to joining India. There's another Sardar Patel equivalent on the Pakistani side, but he's far less effective in a sense. But Patel puts a guy called VP Menon, who I think is one of the most important and often neglected people in these kind of founding fathers of India. Patel is the guy, so Patel's the guy sitting in Delhi, kind of operating things, the puppet master. But Menon's the guy who's going down to the States and trying to personally convince them. And together they're an incredible team. I think we often forget just how many states didn't want to join the country that aligned with their religion. So Jodhpur, for example, is in negotiations with Pakistan for years to see what deal it can get. I think Bhavalpur and Khairpur, both later joining Pakistan, negotiate with Congress for a while. See, basically, far more states than we realize look around to suss out their options. Manipur has brief negotiations with Burma. The state of Dir, in what later joins Pakistan, has negotiations with Afghanistan.
What is... I'm going to have to ask you, I know what negotiations mean, but I'm going to have to ask you, what do you mean by negotiations? Is this sports free agency? What's the mindset?
So I think that the Maharaja of Jodhpur basically is negotiating with Jinnah to potentially become some sort of protectorate of Pakistan that is not fully governed by Pakistan and essentially avoids being annexed by India. And he'll be given a railway to Karachi so that Jodhpur can thrive off trade with the Indian Ocean and some sort of relationship like that. Likewise, Jaisalmer has similar negotiations.
So they wanted to be semi-independent.
They wanted semi-independent and thought that Jinnah might be able to help out. I think a lot of states' negotiations revolve around such an idea of how can we keep our independence most securely. One of the most interesting events, I think, that again hasn't been given the importance that it deserves is the fact that several states in the Khasi Hills, in what's now Meghalaya, actually tried to join Pakistan, and they send in a letter saying like, hey, like, let us know the process. We'd love to join Pakistan. Pakistan never gets back to them. So they wait a month for a response. And having not heard from Pakistan, they make the active point of contacting Sardar Patel and saying, we've not heard back from Pakistan, so we'd like to join you instead. So it's a rather farcical.
But was it? Yeah, exactly. It seems like sports free agents. It seems, I mean, the seriousness with which we defend, 20 square kilometers. This does not seem to have that level of. If Pakistan refused or forgot to respond, for example, why did Jodhpur, Jaisalmer not end up? How did Menon or Sardar Patel win out over their equivalents?
So interestingly, in that case, it wasn't them. I think that the Maharaja of Jodhpur, it's rather hilarious. By all accounts, he asks for some time to think over the option, goes back home and is convinced by his mum not to do it. So Patel and Menon work in all sorts of the other states. So they go off to, for example, kind of Kuch Bihar and Tripura, and they work to convince Mysore and to convince Kutch. And, I think they make a particular effort to try and bring round a lot of the western states. And of course, Menon flies into Junagadh They spent endless weeks negotiating with the Nizam of Hyderabad to try and get
Yeah,
Hyderabad.
I was going to say Hyderabad would have been a tough one.
Hyderabad was a tough one.
How did they kind of manage that?
Hyderabad, the story of Hyderabad, well, I mean, in a sense, the negotiations fail. So what happens is that Nizam of Hyderabad wants to remain independent. Economy rivals Belgium, almost as large as France.
Yeah,
He thinks he's got a good reason to do so. He's trying to negotiate Goa to buy the port and, work as a functional state. What happens, I think the crucial intervention is the Telangana armed uprising. This communist revolution breaks out in the countryside by all these kind of, extractive land, against all these extractive landlords. And to suppress the communists, the Nizam begins relying more and more on these guys, the Razakars. And these guys have been in the news a lot recently. So initially, the Nizam is not relying on these guys. But when the communist revolution breaks out, he starts relying on them to put down the communists. But of course, in addition to putting down the communists, they start kind of burning mandirs in the countryside, etc. And soon, Hyderabad state essentially begins to turn into some sort of civil war between the Nizam's elites, communists, the Razakars, and also Indian nationalists across the border who are kind of diving in, messing things up and going back again. So that eventually, and I think it's September 1948, the Indian army is sent in to basically bring. It's referred to in Indian government as the police action, as if they are sent in to bring law and order. But actually, what it means is that the Air Force is sent in, tanks roll in, and one of the first times that the Indian army is sent into a foreign country, it's sent into Hyderabad. There's this paper called the Sunderlal Report, which was suppressed for years by Sardar Patel, but details the massacres that follow. And so the Indian army is not the one doing these massacres, but as the Indian army goes towards Hyderabad, you get all of these basically guys going in and basically doing land grabs, and often, and a few months later, Congress, I think it's Sarojini Naidu again, convinces Nehru that he needs to create some sort of report on because there's all these reports of communal violence breaking across the state. Basically, often Hindus taking revenge against Razakars, or people who may have been associated against Razakars, but often people with no relation to the Razakars whatsoever, but who just happen to be Muslim. And there's all sorts of bodies found stuffed in baulis, huge number of kind of forced conversions, and 3 times more displacement around the borders of Hyderabad state than the Palestinian Nakba the same year. So I think a lot of people talk about partition as an event that happened in Punjab. And the fact that there is 3 times more displacement in Telangana than there is in the Palestinian Nakba tells you the scale of violence and displacement that we are willfully neglecting and not talking about.
and we know about Goa, but kind of the
I mean, Goa's later. Goa's a decade and a half later.
But the absorption of Hyderabad is kind of sometimes it just seemed a lot easier than Goa did. But obviously, it's the other way around. Hyderabad seems to have been a lot more bloody. And difficult to kind of absorb into the Union. So I'm gonna kind of look a little bit to the future. So much of history tends to repeat itself. Do you think there's within these colonies, the 12 states, you think there is a next split coming? You think there's something that goes next?
Difficult question. I think that there are all sorts of, across these countries that have emerged, there are all sorts of unresolved nationalisms, essentially. There's all sorts of secessionist movements. You mentioned too, I think, Khalistan, there's also Kashmir, Northeast India. You've got the Chittagong Hill Tracts that's been demanding independence in Bangladesh. You've got Balochistan in Pakistan. But to be honest, I think that so far, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh all seem to have a relatively firm grip on their territories. And unless there's another massive war or something massively changes, I don't see them changing anytime soon. The 2 countries, though, that I could see disintegrating and the borders changing are probably Yemen and Myanmar. So Myanmar right now, in the last 5 years, we've had the coup, Aung San Suu Kyi in prison, and today the military controls a very little portion of the country. And I can see a world where in 20 years time or 10 years time, Myanmar may be multiple countries. Likewise, Yemen has had several movements in the middle of its civil war for potentially, separating north and south, and maybe potentially even separating off the Hadramaut region in the east. So it's hard to say, but I think Myanmar is the one that I would most watch for.
So we start at the beginning.
Yeah.
Your Instagram page is amazing. The photos are amazing. The places you visit are really different and really cool.
Thank you.
It's because sort of as we wind down, what are kind of some of the places that you think we don't know about, both sort of in the India as it exists today and sort of the British Raj version, that we should visit, that you found phenomenal?
Sure. So I think the town easily that I enjoy, the two places, I'm going to give two locations that I think blew my mind when I was researching this book. One I'd say is Junagadh. Junagadh we always hear about in the context of independence. Yeah. It's a princely state that tried to join Pakistan and then, thanks to Sardar Patel's machinations, didn't, right? It's an extraordinary town. It's this town of beautiful French Gothic inspired kind of Islamic architecture centered around Girnarji, which is one of the most sacred Jain religious sites in
Jain and Shiv.
Hindi. And Shiva's on top.
It's the only mountain with both temples.
Yeah, and at the base you have you have one of the oldest Ashokan edicts at the bottom, showing that it was and Buddhist caves at the bottom. Okay. And you've got one of the only pre-conquest mosques in India. So mosques built before the first invasions from Afghanistan. Okay. Junagadh has a pre-conquest mosque built for merchants coming in from the Arab world who were coming to trade there. So it's this extraordinary town, and the architecture is amazing, and I would recommend anyone to go. The other city that I would say, or place, is Unakoti in Tripura. I visited Tripura when I was traveling around the northeast for researching the borderlands of Bangladesh and Myanmar and how they relate to India's northeast. And Unakoti is the most extraordinary site. It's this very early Shaiva site, built in the woods behind the, a few hours drive from Agartala. And between about the 4th century and the 10th century AD, there are hundreds of massive Shaiva sculptures carved into the cliff face. Okay. It's a bit like a kind of, just like the Ellora Caves or something, but on a massive scale and with far fewer tourists than anywhere else I've been. I think one of the crucial things is the fact that there's no really good guest house anywhere nearby, so you have to drive a few hours from Agartala. But I think that if that was resolved, if someone, I don't know who's listening to the podcast, but if anyone built a really good guest house near Unakoti, I could imagine it becoming one of India's greatest tourism sites. Okay. But for now, it's still kind of, there's nowhere to stay. Yeah. And it's still just off the tourist circuit as a result.
And so if we have to live vicariously, there's a Substack.
There's a Substack where I write about a lot of my travels. So, whilst...
What's the Substack?
Substack
we'll put up the link as well.
Substack's called Travels of Samwise. Okay. And once a week, I write about some historical location that I visited and the stories around it. So, just recently, I was writing about a town in Thailand called, the old capital called Ayutthaya, that was built by these actually Buddhist rulers, but who were essentially kind of, using the Ramayana epic in their courts, and they name it Ayutthaya after Ayodhya. And it's this extraordinary town that was, in the 1700s, was the largest city in Asia. And yet today, when we think of the great empires of Asia, we think of China, we think of India. Occasionally, we'll think of the Middle East, but we never think of Thailand as having produced one of the great empires. And yet it did.
And next couple of years, what do we have to look forward to? Any interesting topics that you just want to kind of give us a little glimpse?
So I'm particularly interested at the moment in the intertwined fates of French India and French Indochina.
Okay.
So it turns out that a lot of French Pondicherrians, people from Pondicherry and Chandanagar, etc., had played an important role in French Indochina, and the absorption of Pondicherry into India is a story that's far more closely tied to the story of the Vietnam War than I think we tend to realize. And so I'm working on that. There's a fascinating links, and also the fact that the first shots fired in the Vietnam War were actually fired by the Indian Army. That's all the spoilers that I'll give you.
All right.
But the Indian Army shows up in Saigon and fights against Ho Chi Minh's men in a story that, again, we've largely forgotten.
We're going to have to call you back for that. Thank you so much for giving you the time.
Thank you for having me.
And then hope we see you again soon.